She'd spent 3 years proving to an entire territory that she needed nobody, not through drought, not through the hardest winters Dakota had on record. Not through anything the frontier could throw at a woman running 200 acres completely alone. Then, on the worst night of the worst winter in a decade, her roof tore open like a tin can lid, and she had exactly one choice left: freeze alone with her pride intact. Or walk half a mile through a whiteout blizzard to the one door she'd spent 2 years refusing to knock on. Dakota Territory, 1887. She chose the door. What she found on the other side of it was quieter than she expected, and far more dangerous to everything she'd built her independence on, because the man who opened it wasn't going to rescue her. He was going to do something considerably harder. He was going to wait for her to decide she wanted him anyway. And before the spring thaw, a man from the Territorial Land Office is going to show up with a very different opinion about whether a woman alone has any right to that claim at all. Stay till the end. That fight isn't one Lena Marsh planned on having. Lena Marsh had made a point, from the day she buried her father and proved up the family claim in her own name, of showing she needed no one's help to keep it standing. Not through the driest summers, not through the hardest frontier winters, not through anything the territory cared to throw at a woman running a place by herself. The winter of 1886 into 1887 had already tested that resolve harder than any before it. Cattle had frozen standing up in coulees across the territory that season, whole herds lost to storms arriving one after another with barely a week's rest between them. Lena had spent most of December and January rationing feed and hauling water through drifts taller than her fences. She'd managed it. She'd managed everything alone since the day her father's illness first showed itself, through his death. And through 3 winters after it, proving to herself more than anyone watching that the claim was as much hers by right as it had ever been his by law. Her nearest neighbor, a quiet rancher named Gideon Cole, worked land half a mile across the open field, their 2 claims sharing a boundary line neither had ever needed to survey twice. He'd learned to respect that independence the way a careful man learns to respect a fence he doesn't fully understand the purpose of. He never offered help unless she asked for it. She never asked if she could manage otherwise. That arrangement held for the better part of 2 years, until a storm came through in January that neither of them had any say in the terms of. The blizzard arrived without much warning, the way the worst ones on that stretch of prairie generally did, a gray line on the horizon at midday, a full whiteout by supper. Wind strong enough by nightfall to peel back a section of Lena's roof like the lid off a tin can. She'd barred the chicken coop before dark out of old habit, low to the ground and sturdy enough to have held through worse, and turned her worry instead to her own walls once the wind found the weak seam above her kitchen. She fought it as long as pride allowed, propping a board against the widening gap, stuffing quilts into the seam where snow had already begun sifting onto her floor. But when the second gust tore the board loose entirely, she understood with the particular clarity cold and fear bring on together that staying meant risking a great deal more than a damaged roof. She had no one closer than Gideon Cole's ranch, and no time to weigh the matter further. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned and went out into a wind that nearly took her off her feet twice before she'd cleared her own yard, the half-mile to Gideon's place stretching longer than she'd ever known it to be. Snow driving sideways hard enough to sting through her shawl. By the time she reached his door, she couldn't feel her own hands well enough to knock properly. She pounded with the flat of her arm instead and stood there shaking, coated in snow, trying and failing to master the fear she hadn't let herself feel until that exact moment. Gideon opened the door before she'd finished the second strike. He took one look at her, trembling, snow-crusted, her composure clearly costing her everything she had left to spend on it, and pulled her inside without a single wasted word. He built up the fire first, fast and efficient, then found a shirt and trousers from what little the small ranch house had to offer, and set them near the hearth to warm before handing them over. He put a kettle on for something hot and did all of it without asking the obvious questions: why she'd come, how bad the damage was, whether she was truly all right. "There's a room through there you can change in," he said, nodding toward a door. "Take whatever time you need." She came back out swimming in his shirt, the sleeves hanging well past her fingertips, and caught him glancing at them. "If you say one word about these sleeves, I'll go back out into the storm." "Wasn't going to," Gideon said. "They appear to be winning already." He'd poured coffee thick with sugar, considerably more than she'd have made for herself. "That's more sugar than coffee. You were half frozen, so you decided to finish the job a different way." He almost smiled at that, the first crack in his usual composure she'd seen since arriving. "Roof went," she said once she'd settled by the fire. "Wind took the north corner clean off. I couldn't keep the snow out." "You did right coming here," Gideon said. "Wouldn't have wanted you trying to weather that alone." The storm showed no sign of easing, and it became clear within the hour that Lena would be spending the night, the roads impassable. The wind too fierce to risk the walk back, even to check on what remained of her house. Gideon gave her the small bedroom without being asked twice, and carried his own blanket to the chair beside the stove before she'd finished protesting that she didn't need to put him out of his own bed. They sat by the fire for hours before either retired, the conversation moving slowly at first, then easier. The way conversation does between two people who have spent 2 years being careful neighbors and have suddenly run out of reasons to keep being careful. "You're a hard woman to get to know, Miss Marsh," Gideon said at one point. 2 years living half a mile apart, and I don't believe I've heard you ask for so much as a cup of sugar." "I don't like owing people," Lena admitted. "Owing tends to come with strings I'd rather not get tangled in." "Not all strings pull the same direction." He studied her. "What's yours, then?" "Why does a man live alone half a mile from anyone, working land by himself, when Dakota's got no shortage of women who'd take a rancher's proposal gladly?" Gideon was quiet a moment, turning his cup in his hands. "Because loud company never suited me. And quiet company's hard to find. Unless it happens to knock on your door during a blizzard." She told him later that night the thing she'd never told anyone in Dakota Territory, that she'd been engaged once back east to a man who'd broken it off the moment her father's illness left her managing the family's affairs instead of simply waiting prettily for a wedding. "He said a wife ought to need looking after," she said. "Said a woman capable of running her own house made a man feel unnecessary." She looked at her father's pocket watch, which she'd carried in her coat pocket even through the storm, and set it on the table between them, still ticking faithfully despite the cold. "I decided, standing at that broken engagement, that I'd rather be unnecessary to a man than dependent on one who'd leave the moment I proved I didn't need rescuing." "That's not the same thing," Gideon said quietly. "I know that now. I'm not certain I knew it 3 years ago." Gideon didn't try to argue her out of the years of caution that had built. He only said, "Needing help once in a blizzard doesn't undo 3 years of proving you don't need it most days," and let that sit between them without pressing it further. The sky cleared before dawn. Gideon walked Lena back across the field the moment the light was strong enough to see by. Her house told its own story before they'd even reached the door, the north corner of the roof gone entirely. Snow drifted knee-deep through the kitchen, the stove cold and half buried. One wall bowed dangerously inward. She found her father's watch half buried near the stove, still ticking, its face fogged but its hands moving steady. "Still keeping poor time," she said, half laughing, half something closer to tears. "Same as it always has." 2 days later, Gideon hauled the first load of lumber from his own stores. Lena met him at the wagon with a small notebook already in hand. "I'll pay you back for every board. I'd rather owe it plainly than owe it quiets." "Fair enough," Gideon said. "Write it down then, every board, every nail." He handed her the first plank. "I'll expect the same courtesy the other direction, mind you. Every meal you feed me while I'm working goes in that book too." She wrote down the lumber that afternoon, carefully, to the board. She did not write down the coffee or the noon meal or the second cup he lingered over longer than the work strictly required. Gideon noticed. He didn't say anything about it, though the corner of his mouth gave him away. What lumber his own stores couldn't cover, they hauled together from the mill in town, where Otis Reed weighed the order with the slow, deliberate manner of a man who'd been running that yard since before either of them was born. "Rebuilding after the blow, are you?" My roof, Lena said. His lumber, Otis said, nodding at Gideon. His labor by the look of those hands and his horse pulling the wagon. Funny sort of arrangement for two neighbors who barely spoke a civil word to each other before Christmas, far as anyone in town could tell. Small towns notice a great deal, Gideon said. Unbothered. Small towns notice everything, Otis corrected, already writing up the order. And generally get there a season before the people involved do. The work went on through the following weeks, steady and unhurried. Mrs. Alcott from the Mercantile, delivering a tin of nails Lena had ordered before the storm, took one look at the two of them working the new wall together, and did not bother hiding her opinion. You two are going to make this whole town wait considerably longer than necessary before you make it official. Making what official? Lena asked, entirely too quickly. Whatever it is that has Gideon Cole hauling lumber for a woman he's spoken maybe 40 words to in 2 years, Mrs. Alcott said, and left before either of them could formulate a proper denial. They argued once properly over how to rebuild the bowed kitchen wall, Lena wanting it set the way her father had originally built it. Gideon convinced a different bracing would hold better against the next hard wind. My father built this house, Lena said. It stood 20 years his way and came down some in one night my way would have prevented, Gideon said, not unkindly. She was quiet a moment, torn between loyalty to a memory and plain good sense. Show me, she said finally. He showed her. She studied the bracing, asked 2 sharp questions, and told him in the end that his way was better, on the condition that the door frame stayed exactly where her father had set it. Your house, Gideon said, your decision. I'll only argue the parts that'll fall down otherwise. It was, Lena thought, watching him work the new bracing into place. The first time in longer than she could remember that a disagreement hadn't felt like a threat to anything she'd built. She mended the torn seam in his work coat one evening without asking, and left a warm meal at his door the following day when a hard frost kept them both indoors. Small things offered the same quiet way he'd offered his help. You didn't need to do that, Gideon said, finding the coat repaired and folded on his porch rail. I know. I did it anyway. He looked at her a long moment, something shifting behind his usual composure. 2 years, he said, almost to himself. 2 years what? 2 years I watched you manage everything alone and told myself respecting your independence meant staying at a careful distance. I'm starting to think it just meant I was afraid to close it. She pressed him on it that same evening. You noticed me managing my own roof, my own accounts, my own everything, and never once said a word beyond good morning. I noticed you, Gideon said. That's not quite the same as speaking. He was quiet long enough she thought he might not answer at all. I've watched every woman in this territory get courted and married off within a season. I told myself I was giving you room. Truth is, I didn't know what I'd do with myself if I spoke plain and you turned me down flat. Easier to admire a fence from a distance than risk finding out it doesn't want mending. That's a very tidy metaphor for a man who claims he's bad at speaking plain, Lena said, though her voice had gone soft. I've had 2 years to practice it in my head. Saying it out loud is considerably harder. The old fear resurfaced all the same, sharper than Lena expected. On an afternoon when Gideon arrived unannounced with a load of shingles she hadn't asked for and hadn't priced. I didn't request those, she said, more sharply than the moment called for. I know. Found them going cheap at the lumber yard and thought of your roof. That's exactly the kind of thing he used to do, Lena said, and then stopped, hearing herself. Understanding only after the words were out how unfair the comparison was. Gideon didn't defend himself immediately. He set the shingles down carefully and waited. I'm sorry, that wasn't about you. I know that too, Gideon said. But I'd rather you say it plainly than swallow it and let it sit between us. Write the shingles in your book if it eases you, or don't. Either way, I'm not him, and I'd rather you find that out slow and certain than take my word for it. It was some time after that, going back over her small ledger by lamplight, that Lena realized how little of it she'd actually filled in. The lumber, yes, carefully totaled. But weeks of shared meals, shared coffee, shared labor traded freely in both directions, none of it recorded because somewhere in the last month it had stopped feeling like debt at all. What neither of them expected was that the storm that brought them together would also draw attention to something Lena had assumed was long settled. In early March, a man named Corliss Whitfield rode out from the Territorial Land Office in Bismarck, carrying a leather case and a manner of speaking that made every sentence sound like it had already been decided before he opened his mouth. He found Lena at the half-rebuilt house, Gideon up on the new roofline setting shingles and dismounted without being invited to. Miss Marsh. I'm here regarding the Marsh claim, Section 14, proved up in your name in the spring of 1884. It's proved, it's recorded, what's there to discuss? Whitfield opened his case unhurried. A neighboring party has filed a formal challenge, questioning whether the claim was properly proved under the terms of continuous residence and cultivation required by the Act specifically. Whether a woman managing the property alone without male kin in residence satisfies the improvement requirements as the office has come to interpret them since '84. It's not my judgment, Miss Marsh. I'm simply obliged to investigate when a challenge is filed. Lena felt the old cold rise in her chest, sharper than the January wind had ever managed. I've worked that land myself for 3 years, every fence, every furrow. There isn't a man in this county who's put in more hours on it than I have. I don't doubt it, Whitfield said, not unkindly, in the manner of a man for whom kindness had never once changed an outcome. But the office will want to see it documented, witnesses, records of improvement, proof of continuous residence. Absent that, the challenge could see the claim reopened for filing. He glanced up at Gideon on the roof. Is this gentleman able to speak to the property's management? Gideon came down off the roof before Lena could answer for herself. I can speak to it, he said. I've worked half a mile from that boundary line 2 years. I know every improvement on that claim better than most men know their own. The well she dug herself the second summer, the fence line she strung alone the winter her father took sick, the herd she rebuilt twice over after losses that broke bigger operations than hers. If somebody's filed a challenge on the notion that a woman can't hold land without a man's name attached to it, I'd like to know which neighboring party thinks that. Because I've got some fence line business of my own I'd like to discuss with him directly. Whitfield, to his credit, looked faintly uncomfortable. The filing party is a Mr. Aldous Renner, recently arrived from the eastern part of the territory. He's expressed interest in the section should the claim be found deficient. Lena's jaw tightened. She didn't know an Aldous Renner from any other man passing through, but she understood exactly what his interest amounted to: 200 acres of improved land, ready to be taken from a woman on a technicality dressed up as concern for proper procedure. I'll have my records ready for the office's review, she said, voice level. Every furrow, every fence, every season, and I'd ask Mr. Renner think carefully about how it looks to this whole county, filing a claim jump against a woman's homestead a month after the worst winter in a decade nearly killed her proving it. Small towns notice a great deal, Mr. Whitfield. I understand you've heard that said before. Whitfield allowed himself something close to a smile as he closed his case. I have, actually. Word travels fast out here. He tipped his hat. The office hearing will be in 3 weeks in Bismarck. I'd advise bringing whatever testimony and documentation you can gather. These things are rarely decided on paperwork alone. He rode off. Lena stood watching him go, the cold in her chest not entirely gone. 3 years, she said quietly. 3 years proving I don't need help, and it still might not be enough on paper because I'm a woman standing on it alone. You're not standing on it alone, Gideon said, not this time. And you weren't really standing on it alone before either, Lena. The whole county's watched you hold that claim together with your own 2 hands. Whitfield's right about one thing. These things aren't decided on paperwork alone. They're decided on what a room full of people already believe to be true, and what this county believes about you isn't in question. It's only ever been in question on some stranger's ledger in Bismarck. The 3 weeks that followed were not spent on shingles or lumber. Gideon rode the county gathering statements from Otis Reed at the lumber yard, who could account for every board Lena had ever purchased and improved her land with, from Mrs. Alcott at the mercantile, who kept a running account of every season's goods Lena had bought to work the claim herself, from 3 neighboring ranchers who'd watched her break ground, dig her own well, and rebuild her herd twice over. Lena herself spent the evenings going back through the small ledger she'd once used to track lumber and shingles, adding to it now a different kind of record: dates, improvements, seasons. The plain, unglamorous accounting of 3 years of continuous, documented work. It was, she realized partway through, the same instinct that had made her track every board Gideon brought her. The belief that a thing proven plainly on paper couldn't be argued away by a man who'd simply decided to believe otherwise. They rode to Bismarck together the morning of the hearing. Aldous Renner was there, a thin, well-dressed man Lena had genuinely never laid eyes on before, who studied her with the particular blankness of someone who'd filed the challenge on principle and paperwork rather than any actual acquaintance with the land or the woman working it. The hearing did not take long. Lena's ledger, Otis Reed's account books, Mrs. Alcott's records, and the plain statements of 3 neighboring ranchers who'd watched her work that claim with their own eyes left the presiding officer very little to deliberate over. Renner's own case amounted to little more than the assertion that a woman alone couldn't reasonably be expected to meet the Act's improvement standard, an assertion that fell apart considerably once it met 3 years of witnessed, documented fact. The claim was upheld without qualification. Renner left Bismarck that same afternoon and was not heard from again in that county. Riding home, Lena was quiet a long while before she spoke. I used to think needing nobody was the only thing standing between me and losing everything. Turns out what actually protected that claim was a whole county who'd watched me earn it plainly in front of them for 3 years. I couldn't have known that alone. I'd never have thought to ask anyone to remember it if you hadn't gone and asked them to. You didn't need me to hold that claim, Gideon said. You held it yourself every day for 3 years. I only helped you prove it on paper what everyone already knew was true. That's not nothing, Lena said. No, he agreed. It isn't. It occurred to Lena, watching Gideon favor his shoulder one cold morning after the ride back from Bismarck and weeks of work before it, that she'd let considerable time pass without once considering what she might do for him in return, beyond a mended coat and a warm meal. She found him at his own porch a few evenings later, the ledger left behind entirely. I stopped keeping the book, she said. I noticed, Gideon said. Wondered when you would. You never once made me feel like I owed you for any of it. Not the lumber, not the shingles, not the 3 weeks in Bismarck. I kept waiting for the moment you'd remind me what I owed you in return, the way he always did. It never came. Wasn't going to, Gideon said. I never wanted you needing me, Lena. Then what did you want? He took a while answering that one. I'd like to be wanted, he said finally. Not needed, there's a difference. And I think you're the only woman I've known who'd understand it without me explaining it twice. She found him at his porch again the following week. Nothing left to discuss about lumber or shingles or land offices. I've done the noticing you asked for, she said. Took longer than either of us would have liked. I'd like to stop rebuilding 2 separate lives if the offer is still open. It's more than open, Gideon said and took her hand plainly. Marry me, Lena. Not because either one of us needs rescuing. Because I'd rather spend whatever storms come next with you inside my door than watching from across a field, wondering if you're weathering it alone. Yes, Lena said and meant it completely. They married that spring in a small ceremony near the boundary line where their 2 claims had always met, neither her land nor his alone, but ground equally claimed by both, which struck the handful of neighbors who attended, including old Mrs. Alcott, who'd suspected the match since February, as considerably more fitting than either house could have managed. Otis Reed sent lumber for the occasion tables as a wedding gift, refusing payment for once in his long career running that yard, and remarked to anyone who'd listened that he'd known the 2 of them were a settled matter the day they'd argued cheerfully over shingle prices instead of simply paying whatever he asked. Lena kept her homestead rather than abandon it, and the two of them worked both properties together as one operation. Her fierce independence never once asked to disappear, only given somewhere safe to rest alongside someone else's. She still kept a small ledger out of habit more than necessity, though what she wrote in it now had considerably less to do with debts owed, and considerably more to do with which fields to plant and when the calves were due, and, tucked in the back pages, the full record of a land office hearing that had once nearly cost her everything and instead proved, plainly in front of the whole county, exactly what she'd built. They built a new house that summer on the rise near the shared boundary, with a roof Gideon reinforced twice over against any storm Dakota Territory cared to send their way. Lena's father's watch found a permanent place on the mantle, still keeping its same poor time, faithfully wound each evening by whoever happened to pass it last. On the first anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, they sat on that new porch and watched the same kind of gray line gather on the horizon that had once sent Lena running half a mile through the snow. "Storm's coming," Gideon observed. "Let it come," Lena said, leaning into him without a trace of the old caution. "I've got exactly where I want to weather it." That same week, a letter arrived from the land office in Bismarck, a routine notice, nothing more, confirming the marsh coal claim's status as settled and unchallenged for the coming year. Lena read it once, folded it, and set it beside her father's watch on the mantle rather than in the ledger, because some records, she'd decided, belonged somewhere a person could see them every day, not tucked away as though they still needed proving. "You keep that like it's something to be proud of," Gideon said, watching her set it down. "It is," Lena said. 3 years, I thought the only proof that mattered was the kind I could carry alone. Turns out the proof that actually held was the kind a whole county was willing to stand up and say out loud because they'd watched me earn it. I couldn't have gathered that by myself. I didn't know I needed to until you went and asked them to remember." Gideon didn't answer right away. Just watched the storm building slow and distant over the fields that had once belonged to two separate people and now belonged, plainly and on paper, to one shared name. Then he took her hand the way he had on that porch the week she'd finally stopped keeping the book, and they watched the weather come in together, not because either of them needed watching over, but because there was nowhere else, storm or otherwise, that either one particularly wanted to be. Lena Marsh spent 3 years proving she needed no one, certain that independence was the only promise strong enough to keep itself. Gideon Cole spent those same years admiring that independence from a careful distance, more afraid of being turned away than he ever let himself admit. It took the worst storm of the winter, the slow, ordinary work of rebuilding afterward, and a stranger's challenge that nearly cost her everything to show them both what neither had let themselves say aloud, that choosing someone isn't the same as needing them. That proof built alone can still be strengthened by people willing to stand beside you, and that the safest place in any storm has always been beside the person you trust enough to knock on their door.